Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will begin in 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome ACEC President and CEO Dave Raymond.
Good afternoon. We have a very special guest with us today, and I hope you've all filed your tax returns on time. I mean, the combination of having a former IRS commissioner and the former head of the National Security Agency who has access to all of these files, whether you are aware of it or not, is kind of a daunting thing. So, Mark Everson, who was the commissioner of the IRS, is now vice chairman for the Alliant Group, a specialty provider of tax services. They've worked with many of your firms. He's with us to discuss today basically Washington tax reform and the IRS. He served in the Bush administration as commissioner of the IRS from 2003 until 2007. He also served as deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget. In the Reagan administration, he served with the U.S. Information Agency and also at the Department of Justice. And before all of that, he was in the private sector as group vice president of finance at a very large food services company called SC International Services. He also served as an executive in the Pecheney Group, which is one of France's largest industrial companies. So it's our pleasure today to have Mark with us.
Thank you, Dave. I know you've heard from a very seasoned and prominent anchorman, and you've heard from the former director of the CIA, but my secrets are just as good as their secrets. So let's get that right out there. I'll do my best to hold my own with them. At Alliant, as Dave indicated, we work with many of your members. We're proud to do that. What we do is we provide specialty tax services that complement the work that your normal CPA does in areas like R&D, 179D, export incentives, a series of things which are very technically complex, and some of which we'll get into a little bit, some of those provisions that you're concerned about, I know, in tax reform and the extenders, and we'll talk about them in a follow-on session with my colleague, Sonny Grover. What you do is important. It matters in America whether we make things, whether we build things, and whether we help people go places. So you serve a very important public purpose. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit, as Dave indicated, about the current situation in Washington, how that impacts tax reform, the Affordable Care Act, and the IRS. But let me start. My dad, he died right before the turn of the century, but he probably should have been born in another century, about 200 years ago, because what he really wanted to do, he should have been born an Englishman, and he would have loved to send me off to sea as a midshipman, and then see whether I came back or not as an admiral, or ended up just not coming back, or just whatever would have happened. But when I was 17, I went off to Zambia to work on a poultry farm. That was my first, and you could argue in some ways my most challenging job. I ran a butchery when I was 17 years old. I had 35 people working for me. They spoke Bemba, only 7 spoke English, and it was a formative experience. And I remember in the fall of 1971, I had to go visit the housing compound that was attached to the farm. We had a hatchery, we had a broiler grow-out, and we had a slaughterhouse. And for some reason, I had to go find somebody, and I walked out to the compound, which was just outside the formal fence of the farm, and it was a beautiful night. There was this full moon, this large full moon that those of you who have been to Africa would know you only seem to see in Africa. And as I was talking to my colleague who worked in the butchery, he said to me, remember, this is only 2 years after 1969. He looked up at the moon and he said, "You are American. Have you been to the moon?" And that was not such a far-fetched question coming from someone in one of the more remote places on the planet, given the lack of the internet and the lack of cable TV and all the communication which is so prevalent today. But what it reflected was, it was this incredible triumph of American science, American engineering, and American R&D that had created this sense of pride and wonderment across the world. And it's given rise, if you will, it's contributed to the last 4 or 5 decades of an American ascendancy, if you will, where the American brands of capitalism, of democracy, and even military might have been the driving force across the globe. And we've seen much progress and much success come about from all of those factors. I do use the 60s as a reference point. I'll turn 60 later this year. And I remember the 60s. And it wasn't all just the good news of the moon landing or those achievements. There was a lot of turmoil. We talk now about our political institutions, but it's very striking the lack of turmoil that we have now in contrast to that period. We've marked a whole series of anniversaries, half-century anniversaries in recent months, the last several years. Civil rights moments. The war on poverty fairly recently was talked about. The assassination of President Kennedy. There will be more things that will come up and that we will talk about. More assassinations. The Vietnam War. I lived in Greenwich Village in the 70s. Right down the street, there was an empty lot where the brownstone, the weathermen had blown up a brownstone on West 11th Street, if you remember that. they weren't playing beanbag in the political process there. There was a lot of engagement and a lot of turmoil across the country. This led to a lot of very positive things in the sense of more equality and opportunity. But it was at the same time a very transformational moment in the sense that it led to a deterioration of institutions and power of institutions across the country. There is, ironically, at the same time that that's taken place, also a centralization of power. Think about tax for just a minute. For those of you who follow it, Chairman Camp, the House Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, just a couple months ago, he put forth his plan for tax reform. And the Speaker of the House said in response to it, blah, blah, blah. Well, the example that's always used is the Tax Reform Act of '86. If Danny Rostenkowski had put forth a plan when he was running Ways and Means, and Tip O'Neill had said blah, 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 he would have found himself floating in the Back Bay of Boston. So what we've had is, and you can look at any number of indicators here, and the technology, by the way, has contributed to this. The technology has provided an access into the political process, into communication. It has brought us closer together in many ways, but it has also fractured the normal order. And with a result that you've seen this deterioration of institutions, certainly in the Congress, and a centralization of power both in the Speaker's office or the leader's office in the Senate or in the West Wing. This president has exercised his executive authority fully, and then some. So you've seen changes where the normal processes and institutions have been affected. And what's happened is there's been a tendency to have the power shift to the edges for a whole variety of reasons that I know Bob Schieffer and others have already spoken to you about. And there's been a dominance of the edges and not an inability to do things in the center. And this is not only a factor on the right. Sure, we all know about Ted Cruz, fair enough. But it's equally true on the left. The president could not get through his clear choice, Larry Summers, to run the Fed. Liberal senators, Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, said, no, no, not so fast, Mr. President. We're not going with your boy, Larry. That's quite a statement to brush back a sitting president from your own party. The same thing, go back to the election. The president won the election. It was really, there wasn't a lot of policy content in the election, but there was a statement on his side to raise taxes on the wealthy. The Republicans would have given him higher taxes than they did give him after the election. But what happened was his folks wouldn't go along on some of the entitlement reforms. All of a sudden you had Dick Durbin and others saying, wait a minute, we're not going to mess with Social Security. We're not going to reform Social Security. We want it's just going to be all about taxes. Well, that was the influence of the left. Because if we can't fix Social Security, we can't fix any of these entrenched entitlements. That is the toughest, or pardon me, that is the easiest thing to fix, the Social Security is. So what you've got is, at the same time, you've got this dominance from the two extremes, and you have, going back again, contrasting it to the 60s, you've got a complacency. I live in Indianapolis. I was talking to a gal who's eat at a bar, Rock Bottom Brewery. They have a chain around the country, and they take good care of me. And I was talking to the bartender the other night, and I said, do you vote? Did you vote last time? He said, nope. She said, but I don't complain. And unfortunately, that is what's happened. There's a lack of engagement. There's only an engagement at the extremes. So where are we now? Things are better. Clearly, the economy is better. We've now reached a point where overall private sector employment is back to where it was before the fall. But it hasn't returned the way one would hope. And I think that reflects this continuing transformation of the economy. Again, many of the impacts of technology and innovation and improvement, which have resulted in the need for fewer jobs. And what you've really seen here is, I think, in this deep recession we've just been through, was an acceleration of that transformation. Employers became more productive, more efficient, and savings that they would have realized over a longer period of time, they've just now put into place. And that's why you've seen the employment coming back, if you will, slowly. But things are better. They're much better. CBO has just updated their in-year deficit projection, the fiscal year that ends this September, and they're projecting that the deficit will be down to 2.8%. That contrasts to 9.8% for 2009, which was the worst period when you had the dearth of revenues, and on the other hand, you had a lot of money going out the door on the spending side. So that issue, and it won't stay down, by the way. It comes back, roaring back in the out years because of folks like me getting older and the need to carry the population as it ages. But you will see that whole concern about the deficit that was such a driver for the Republicans has now largely dissipated. It's just not talked about that much anymore. It's there, but it's not, nobody's talking about shutting down the government to control the deficit, especially after what happened when the Cruz-led debacle ensued last October. So it's all about the Affordable Care Act all the time. I think that if you look at the Affordable Care Act, you have to evaluate it, and it's still early to evaluate it, from three vantage points. The first is the overall architecture of the statute. If you're at the IRS, you run the tax system of the country, you've spent a lot of time thinking about penalties. What incentivizes certain behaviors? What's the proper balance between service and enforcement? The Affordable Care Act has a series of penalties, taxes, that apply on the individual side, the individual mandate, and also for businesses. And the question is simply, and we don't know the answer to this yet, will those taxes drive enough people into the pool? I speak across the country with different CPAs, and particularly in certain sectors, they tell me that companies really are doing a very careful analysis of the cost posture associated with the Affordable Care Act. So as to determine what's in their best interest, what from a business sense do they need to do? What's cheapest, if you will? The same thing applies on the individual side. I've got a young son. Actually, I have a very young son. He's almost 6, and then an older young son. He's 20. He'll be 27 in a week or two. He's right over in Northern Virginia. He's a very buff guy. He looks a lot like Andrew Luck, which was a lot of fun when he came out for the Super Bowl in Indianapolis. And but Leonard, he's done great. This is a guy. He was a Turkish orphan. Adopted him when we were living overseas in Turkey in the early '90s, and he's super fit. He never had health care. He struggled to get through high school, and boy, but now he has made it. My mother always said he's going to be a salesman, and he is. He's leasing townhomes and apartments over in Fairfax County, and now he's the director of sales. He's got 15 people working for him. This is a great triumph. So if you take one thing away from my talk, it's don't give up on your kids. That's what I would really tell you. At any rate, Leonard never had health care until this year when he got this management position. And if you'd asked Leonard, who works out 5 times a week, Leonard, do you want to pay the $1,700 for the bare bones program? And I looked up what it would have cost him in Northern Virginia. Or do you want to pay $700, 1% of $70,000? That's a simple decision for a guy who's invincible. He's going to take his chances. So we don't know yet whether these penalties are enough to push everybody into the system. We also know, or another question is the overall complexity, can the statute be executed? It was a very rough start, which I find inexplicable. I mean, and the wisdom here, you know, what they say in the paper, or the explanation is that, well, we just don't do technology right in the government. It's just very hard to do this and work with contractors. Well, my goodness, we can bug Angela Merkel's cell phone, and we have all of your phone records going back. We can certainly do this. We just chose not to do this correctly. We did not devote the proper resources, the proper manpower and energy and supervision to it. And there are indications. I was reading an article yesterday in Politico and talking about, you know, the back end of the system still isn't tied in. This is where it's got to be tied in, the insurance companies and the exchanges and everything. And it's still not where it needs to be. We'll see how this goes. But it's an extremely complex statute with any number of interfaces, if you will. I ran 2 of the most complex agencies in government, the INS, where I was the number 2 and oversaw the amnesty program, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86, and the IRS. We at least had the advantage of one federal statute, complex as each was. Here you have 50 different programs because the definition of essential coverage varies by state. You have interactions of all states. So it's a massively complex undertaking. The last question really here is you've got to look very carefully at what are the unintended consequences of the act, more or less outside the lane. The one I always go back to is the definition of full-time employee.